Welcome to the little town of Oakham in Rutland, which has a special secret, and it's this. Through that gateway over there is the best preserved 12th century building in Britain. And it wasn't just the home to lots of Norman knights and lords, it once hosted some of our most legendary Saxon kings and queens. But there's more to Oakham Castle than meets the eye. Under these lumps and bumps lies some fascinating history.
Well, there you have it.
And getting to grips with it is no walk in the park.
Well, I'm confused.
Can we rise to the challenge? It looks pretty disgusting to me. And piece together an entire 12th century Norman castle.
Just a stately home with attitude.
We'll know in 3 days.
Right, time's short, Ian. Let's get on with it.
This motley crew might not look capable of it just now, but Time Team can reconstruct entire towns, families and eras from the fragments of pottery, glass and stone they dig up.
Plenty of lumps and bumps out here.
Oakham lies in the tiny county of Rutland, east of Birmingham and in the heart of what was once medieval England. This rich agricultural land sat at the crossroads of major trading routes, making it a magnet for invasion. The Romans, Vikings, Saxons, and then the Normans in the 11th and 12th centuries. It's that last period we're hoping to uncover in the latest invasion at Oakham. Leading the charge this week is Commandant Neil Holbrook.
But then this edge here won't be nice and vertical.
First Lieutenant Phil Harding is our key archaeologist.
To spray out the whole of his trench.
And Staff Sergeant John Gator will be looking into the ground using the magic of radar. But what are we invading exactly? There's no tower, no arrow slits, no curtain wall. Not very, well, castle-y. Neil, is that really a castle? Because to me, it looks like some sort of medieval great hall.
Well, it is a hall, but it's set within a castle. If you look around, Tony, you've got this defended enclosure. That is the fortified centre of Oakham. That's known as the castle. So this hall is set within a castle.
But we're not looking for walls that go like that all the way around.
No, not at all.
The Norman invaders needed to defend their settlements. They'd build a tower on top of an earthwork mound known as a motte and add a curtain wall, which encircled a flat area called a bailey, stuffed with other buildings. But here, those buildings have disappeared. Geophysicist John Gator has already made a start on this area at the end of the hall.
What we've been asked to look for is a building that comes this side of the hall?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're still looking for it.
You haven't managed to find it?
We've got one or two responses that could be buried masonry. I mean, the radar isn't giving us a clear picture at the moment. And I'm not sure why, to be honest.
OK, so we've got all this jumbled archaeological knitting. How are we going to start unpicking it?
We start over here, I think. We open up a trench in this area.
All I'd say, though, is ignore us with regards to archaeology, but you can't ignore us about the services. It seems to be chock-a-block full.
Where are the services?
Well, there's
where are the on the geophysics?
You can see them in detailed.
Do you see services?
Here we go. But it's already. Just watch out that you don't get electrocuted, gassed or drowned.
You've never bothered about it before. Why this sudden concern?
Because I love you. Phil's under orders to open the first trench at this end of the hall, where these blocked up doors are a big clue that something was once here. It could be an early extension or even kitchens, which were often attached to great halls.
Custom help, lads. Can we get the boards and the polythene down around the back of the trench, please?
But this wouldn't be Time Team without an immediate technical hitch. Matt's gizmo is picking up an electricity cable, slap bang across the path where Phil wants to put his trench.
Well, what we're going to try and do is to try and avoid a electricity cable coming across here.
So what he wants to do, Ian, is start here. That line there is the cable.
Dodging cables is the least of John's worries. So far far, he's not getting anything that looks like a bit of solid masonry on the geophys. If you can't work out what the problem is, we could be in for a long 3 days. While the team puzzle over what they have or haven't got outside, inside is an altogether greater puzzle. One of the weirdest interior design jobs I've seen in 20 years. This beautifully preserved hall is home to 350 presentation horseshoes donated by visiting dignitaries and royalty. 1,000 years of history hanging on the wall. Big question, why horseshoes?
Well, we know at the time of Doomsday it's owned by the Crown, but at some point in the early 12th century it's granted to a family called de Ferrers, the Norman family. They were originally from Ferrières in Normandy. And it's probably for that reason that we have all these horseshoes, because although the earliest horseshoe is 15th century, it may well be a pun, that tradition, on the name Ferrers, farriers.
Walklin de Ferrers, who built Oakham Castle about 1185, was a favourite of Richard I, more famously known as Richard the Lionheart. Norman knights like de Ferrers had strong links with English nobility through their battle exploits. Richard and de Ferrers fought side by side during the Crusades.
This is the people who went with Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, on crusade. Interesting that he's identified as from Normandy, not from England, and he's the first name in the list. Look, Walklin de Ferrers. And then later in the Chronicle we see him mentioned again there as that noble man, Walklin de Ferrers, distinguishing himself somehow.
It's interesting, isn't it, that de Ferrers always comes first or second in these lists, or at least high up.
He's high up the list, and that's significant. It shows how close he must have been to Richard himself, and one of his most trusted captains.
Oakham's association with one of royalty's most favoured knights means this was surely a pretty fancy pad. Given de Ferrers' status, it's likely he splashed some serious cash on buildings, fittings and furnishings. Landscape archaeologist Stuart Ainsworth is joining forces with architectural historian Richard K. Morris to seek clues as to what else might have surrounded de Ferrers Hall.
What sort of other buildings would you sort of expect if you were looking down on the Bailey in the 12th century or something?
Well, I think it'd actually be chock-a-block with other buildings here. You'd have buildings servicing the Great Hall, like the kitchens, storerooms, that sort of things. There'd have to be lodgings. There'd have to be a private chamber block for the Lord of the Manor. And then there'd be stabling and smithies and workshops, all that sort of thing.
Really busy.
Very busy,
I mean,
yeah,
there are
yeah.
lots of things going on around this site, and I think I need to go from on the outside and kind of come into it.
And I need to find a nice comfy seat and just sit inside the building and contemplate.
Typical architectural approach, like you've got the easy job.
Well, I hope they're going to come up with some better insights than the archaeologists. 2 hours into Phil's Trench and there's no sign of a building. Still, John's now had time to come up with an excuse why.
I think the clay could be the reason why the radar's not working. If that clay's more...
There's the cable.
Well, at least they found the location of the cable.
There's the tape, but the cable's underneath there.
Forward a little bit then.
Basically, if there's any thickness to that clay, that could explain why the radar isn't working. So, because the signal from the radar will be totally absorbed by the clay. It can go through concrete, it can go through tarmac, but the clay acts like a sponge.
Clay is the worst thing you can find.
Yep.
And we've got it.
Yep.
Oakham Castle is open to the public and managed by English Heritage. And for local inspector Tim Allen, it's a site he's been itching to dig for years. You're really quite passionate about this place, aren't you?
It's a site that had it become less sort of visible to the people of Rutland and the people who come and visit. And if we can do something that raises its profile in the local community, makes it more loved and understood, that would be brilliant.
Tim's high hopes are being hampered by the not-so-brilliant geophys results. So we're going back to basics. Take one landscape archaeologist, one pencil and a notebook. Stuart's plotting the lumps and bumps in the grass to see if any of them look building-shaped. He's picked out a prime candidate for a second trench here, but realistically we're flying pretty blind, so bets are open as to what it might be.
I mean, I really hope it's a medieval structure, but if it proves to be a later garden feature, well, at least we know that and we can discount it from the plan. So, yeah, one trench, let's get it in now. Let's find the answer.
It'll be a garden feature. In order to settle the argument, Cassie and Tracy open the second trench. It's in an area you'd normally expect to find castle outbuildings. Across the lawn, though, at least you can always depend on Phil to sniff out some archaeology. What you got there, Phil?
Well, it's early days yet, Tony, but I really do begin to think we've got evidence of a wall. I mean, you can see all these nice stones, they're all really, really laid in flat. And you can see there is the slightest of edges coming down there. And I think they really could be part of a wall, actually going straight towards the jamb on that doorway there.
This one here?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's bang on line. But the interesting thing too is we've got this sort of mounded surface that's got all this burning and charcoal in, and that really is going straight towards...
For the door?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it looks like we've got a corridor or a pathway or something that is going through there, straight through that doorway.
Matt, we've got some great archaeology. What about the finds?
Loads of finds out of this trench already. And the reason for that is overlying all the archaeology that Phil's just been talking about was a huge pile of demolition rubble, and most of it was roof tiles like this. Can you just see with the little hole in there?
For the nail?
Yep, for the nail. We've had loads and loads of these. Had loads of nails as well to hold them in. And then best of all, we have this crested ridge tile there.
Why has it got lots of little holes in it?
Well, the little holes are to stop it exploding when it's fired. So you go through it and you burst any air pockets in there.
Like you do with a baked potato.
Well, exactly, yeah. And these are worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
So you don't want it to blow up and take out all your ridge tiles in the kiln. So you go to great lengths to make sure that doesn't happen. So you perforate loads of them.
So it does seem that there was a really substantial building here, which is what we were trying to prove.
It certainly was, and it certainly had a very fine roof.
Finally, it looks as though Phil's got a building that would have been connected with the Great Hall. The posh roof tile suggests something grand, but we've no dates yet and no idea what sort of building it actually is. Over in Cassie's trench, it looks like Stuart's punt might have come up trumps. Suffice to say, it's definitely not a garden feature. This carved stone suggests a doorway.
So one edge of the doorway is where your foot is.
I am in the wall.
Yeah. And where's the other edge of the...
Under the grass.
If we can find the other side of this door, we can send out how wide it is, and that will have an impact on what this building would have been. If it's here, say, it could be just an ordinary people door. If it's about here, then that's a wider door, that's a horsey-sized door.
So, Richard, would you buy this as potentially a medieval stables to go with the castle?
If this is a wide door, yeah, no problem.
End of day one, and quite frankly, today's archaeology has been really frustrating. We've got some kind of corridor going through that trench there, leading off from the Great Hall, but where it's going, none of us has got the faintest idea. Over in this trench, well, I was wrong. It wasn't a garden feature. We do have some kind of structure, but we can't yet date it. The really good news, though, is round this little corner, and John is holding it. What have you got, John?
No, you've got to come round another corner first.
Oh, yeah?
I mean, basically, we've had so much flack today that we found nothing at that end. We've decided to look at this end of the hall.
Yeah.
And basically, that's where we are on the plan. And look at these radar results. I think that could be a range of buildings.
And what's so significant about finding buildings here?
This is the high status end of the hall where the nobles would have eaten. So could this be the chambers of the Lord and Lady of the Manor?
Will we find the Norman High Table? Will we find the Lord's quarters? Will we find his bedroom? Will this drizzle stop? We'll know tomorrow. Beginning of day two, and the weather forecast says sunshine today, which is great. Beyond the Great Hall here, they're going to start excavating for the posh end of the Norman castle. Over here, we've got some kind of structure just there behind John, but we don't know what it is yet. And in Phil's trench, everyone's beavering away. Well, they will be when they finish their tea. Morning, team. Morning, Phil. The great thing about Time Team is that it always has us on the edges of our seats, doesn't it? It's all go for site director Neil Holbrook, with 2 trenches open in front of the hall and one at the back. We're trying to piece together what this Norman complex once looked like. And now Phil's finished his morning cuppa, hopefully we'll start to get some answers. In the stable trench, the team are uncovering more walls.
We've got a wall here.
And they're not the only ones.
Raksha, I hear you found something.
Well, I've just actually found a wall, but I'm absolutely confused about this. The wall on the geophys should actually be running in this direction, and we have something that seems to be either added onto it or is part of it. I'm utterly confused.
You're not the only one, Raksha. There seems to be a second wall underneath the one showing on the geophys, and it's on a completely different alignment to the Great Hall. So if this is our first glimpse of Walkland de Ferrers' posh living quarters, it suggests they were completely separate to the hall itself, and that's pretty unusual.
Well, I'm confused. I wasn't expecting this.
While Raksha perseveres with her perplexing trench, Phil's going great guns in his. He and guest pottery guru Jane Young are taking stock of what he's found so far, and together it's building a compelling case that we're in the Norman kitchen and through passage.
Tony?
What?
You haven't seen this, have you? Come and share with me this star find.
What you got? It looks pretty disgusting to me.
To you it might look disgusting, but to us it is our star find. You know what it is?
It's a manky old bit of metal.
No, it's not. It's a horseshoe.
Oh, you're joking.
No, I'm not.
What a lovely find.
It's a horseshoe from Oakham. It really is.
How brilliantly appropriate is that? This isn't a ceremonial horseshoe like the ones up there, will it?
I rather suspect that's to come off a dobbin, hasn't it, Jane?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, horse might have been on the Norman menu, but the reason the shoes turned up in the kitchen area could well be because a few metres away, Cassie and Tracy are digging what we think is a stable block. What's more, they've got something to date it.
Got some pottery from the layer that I'm doing at the moment, and that's 12th, 13th century. And that's sealed by the tumble from the wall.
Right.
So I think we can safely say it's medieval.
So what kind of building could this be, Richard?
I think they'd be quite grand, bearing in mind how close they are to the Great Hall and how important the horse was to your average medieval knight. So I think they'd be a fairly grand stone-built building.
After a slow start, the pieces of Oakham Castle are finally slotting together. These classy stables would have taken pride of place within the Bailey enclosure, but the question of what surrounded the Bailey is one for landscape archaeologist Stuart Ainsworth. The frustrating thing about looking for a castle like this is it's all lumps and bumps. You never get any tangible idea of what the castle would actually have looked like.
Well, look at that.
Yes, see what you mean.
Does that look a bit like Castle Wall or something?
Well, there's certainly something there, isn't there?
After the Normans came, a stone curtain wall is put all the way round. And what we're looking at here, the remains of that curtain wall.
But that looks really curved, Stu.
Well spotted it is. It's the remains of a D-shaped tower which stuck out from the walls. And it's interesting because you can see it on this 1787 map. And the more you walk around and probe under the ivy, you can see where there might have been other towers.
Stuart thinks there may have been towers in all four corners of the site. They'd have been D-shaped, extending out from the wall on stone bases. This would have given them a 180-degree view of the wall and neighbouring towers, an imposing statement of power and prestige.
Raksha, I can always tell by the sound that's much more solid at that end of the trench.
Within Oakham's impressive walls lay a number of seriously classy buildings. Raksha thinks she may have discovered the outer wall of Walkland de Ferrers' living quarters.
Possibly this is the back end of it. It seems to be following the geophys, although I hate to say it. But, you know, it seems to be behaving itself.
Tim, is this what you'd expect to find?
This is very much what we're hoping for, that because we've got proper mortar masonry and maybe we've got the infill of some sort of ground floor room here.
And then I guess what would happen, there'd be some stairs or something that would have come out of there?
Yeah, you'd have an exterior stair up to a main door at first floor, right?
Okay. So where we are now, if we looked up, we could be Walkland de Ferrers' bedroom.
Could be right up there.
It's tantalising to think we may have located Royal Knight de Ferrers' most private quarters, but we still don't have the dates to nail it. Undeterred, Stuart's on his next mission to reveal more hidden gems surrounding the castle. Or Or in other words, he wants to get in the chopper and see a bird's eye view of 12th century Oakham. The Normans were renowned for their castle building prowess and solid defences. De Ferrers was no exception. Stuart can clearly see from the air how the Normans diverted the course of the nearby river, building a channel to the castle to feed a moat. Back on terra firma, and Stuart's itching to update Neil on what he's found.
What I've discovered going up in the air and taking a wider view is what's happening is there are two streams. What they've done in the Norman period is taken a branch off that, a man-made branch, and cut it down to here.
So how far away is that?
Well, it's best part of a kilometre up here.
I mean, it's an incredible investment in time and effort, isn't it, to actually divert a whole river effectively?
Well, the Normans are good at that sort of thing, engineering, you know, with monasteries and all that, bringing water in it. They're good water engineers.
Yeah, that's an amazing discovery.
It's worth the helicopter ride.
Stuart's findings underline how emphatically the invading Normans stamped their mark on Britain. The moat and bailey, or inner enclosure, were built right at the heart of the existing Anglo-Saxon settlement of Oakham. These structures were designed to keep the locals out, leaving them to beg at the town gates. But it wasn't just the Normans who put Rutland on the map. Its royal connections go back even earlier. Historian Mark Morris has unearthed some surprising evidence.
Rutland was always this anomalous unit, which was a piece of land that was given to the queens of England from the late 10th century as part of their dowry. And if you look at this charter, for example, of Edward the Confessor...
Edward was the king up till 1066.
Up until January 1066, yes. His death sets in train the process that leads to the Norman conquest. You can see in this charter of Edward's, we've got Rutland, mentioned for the first time in any document. So Rutland being given as a dower portion to his queen, Edith.
What do we know about her?
Quite a lot, because she commissioned a history of Edward's reign, and unsurprisingly as the patron, she comes across very well. She's described as beautiful, virtuous, accomplished, speaking many languages, very good at needlework.
Edward the Confessor's wife Edith was also King Harold's sister. He and 3 of her brothers were killed at the Battle of Hastings. Unfortunately, none of them had any offspring, so unless Edith produced an heir to the Anglo-Saxon throne, control would be handed to the conquering Normans.
The great debate about her is whether she didn't have a child because Edward didn't sleep with her, as she claimed, or whether they were just simply unlucky and infertile.
So if she and her husband had been a bit more friendly to each other in Oakham, we might still all be Saxons?
We might still all be Saxons, yes.
So not only did Oakham attract the highest echelons of Norman society, it was a place fit for the Saxon Queen Edith. But what we don't yet have is any trace of anything Saxon in the ground. What would really help move things along would be some lovely, clear, crisp geophys results.
Of a rectilinear structure. Do bear in mind, to date, Jimmy has got nothing right on this survey.
What's happened to teamwork, eh? As Jimmy puts his all into radaring every lump and bump, Rakshaw's edging closer to De Ferrer's bedroom, and the other trenches are certainly not short on finds. But in truth, we're still in the dark over huge chunks of the Norman complex, and there's now just a day and a half to resolve it. Afternoon, day 2, and we've all been waiting with bated breath for John's geophys results because they could hold the key to this end of the site. John, how've they gone?
A bit mixed, to be honest.
A bit mixed? I oversold him a bit, didn't I?
Well, that's an improvement on yesterday, isn't it,
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Look, we've done quite an extensive survey now, and we've got a big sample of the whole area. And clearly, there's some parts of the site where we're not seeing walls, and I suspect that's due to clay.
But there is some good news. One area shows a concentration of solid radar reflections, suggesting floors and walls, right next to Rakshaw's trench. Building expert Richard's got a hunch what it might be.
Could be a chapel. It's going to be a ground floor chapel. It's not going to be like a first floor hall that we've got possibly in the chamber block. So hopefully it will have a tiled floor or remains of glazed tiles.
So if we find a medieval building, there's bits of smashed up glazed floor tile in it, we've definitely got a chapel.
We've definitely got a chapel, yes.
Well, there's only one way to test that theory. Trench number 4.
Quite deep that, Justin, so we want to get it all out.
Time Team's Matt has his eyes peeled for anything resembling a Norman chapel.
Can't see any glazed tiles just at the moment.
Building the complete picture of what Oakham Castle once looked like isn't exactly plain sailing.
Go down a bit further at this far end.
We've got a distinct lack of meaningful structures in our trenches, so Rakshas turned to architectural historian Richard for some help, but she's unprepared for what Richard's thinking.
So, Richard, you've dragged me all the way to the top of this rampart. I'm looking down at this precipice. Why are we here?
Well, you've been working away at that trench down there and your walls are coming this direction and kind of disappear into the rampart. Well, I think the rampart might be a bit of a red herring.
We'd originally thought Rakshas Trench was where you'd expect to find the high-status living quarters, but the curving walls seem to extend all the way to the castle's outer defences, and Richard's theory is that a royal bedchamber wouldn't be positioned so close to the defences.
Yeah.
So back to the drawing board for Raksha and a race against time to work out what her building actually is. Luckily in his trench, Phil's showing Matt what he thinks is a well, exactly what you'd expect to find in a kitchen.
So we've just got the edge of it coming round.
That's right, it's coming round. There, look, you can see it's got a lovely arc on it there. But the important thing is that it looks like this round here is the hole that they dug to build the well in.
Right.
So that means that there was already a building here with stone slates on before that well was put in.
Right.
That is an crucially important piece of information that we didn't know about.
This discovery not only confirms that Phil's located the hall's kitchens, which would have put meat and grog on the table of the Norman lords, but the roof slates suggest that this could be a building that predates the Norman Hall. With new information now pouring in, Richard and Time Team graphic designer Alex are starting to redraw the entire plan of Oakham Castle and its surrounding buildings.
This block here, the service block where Phil's been digging, I think that needs to be butting against the gable end of the hall.
So flush to the hall,
flush to the hall wall there.
Okay.
But it's beginning to give it a kind of life, isn't it? I like that.
Yeah, no, it's getting there.
Yeah.
At the back of the hall, though, the picture's still about as clear as mud. Side director Neil was hoping for a chapel in Matt and Cass's trench. I'm no archaeologist, but it's not quite the Sistine yet.
Matt and Cassie, last time I was here, we had all these dumps of rubble over the top. They've all gone now, but what have we actually got underneath?
The only clear feature we have is this ditch along here.
Could this be the first sign of a chapel wall?
Well, let's get on with it, because the one thing I would say is that you can hear all that thunder coming.
Yeah.
I think it's going to rain before long.
Let's do the clay first.
With the weather on the turn, I think it's time to check out how pottery expert Jane's doing in the nice, cosy finds tent. What comes out of the trenches helps us date the structures we uncover. We've been growing increasingly frustrated because we haven't been finding many archaeological structures in the ground. But at the same time, the finds have been coming up like there's no tomorrow. And look at all this stuff, loads of it. Jane, you've been scrubbing like crazy, haven't you, for 2.5 days?
It's been an amazingly productive site. Lovely assemblage that's come up from the material.
So tell me the story of what you've got here.
I've got these lovely vessels like this one here, which is a jug. This is from Nottingham, and it's 13th century, and it would probably have been nicely decorated. Being a knight jug with a knight in armour with a horse running round. And the trenches behind, in trench 3 and 4, we have had nicer tiles. So this one here, which is fabulous, it's like a coxcomb.
That's really high status, isn't it?
Yeah, if you can imagine it on the top of the roof and people coming along and pointing to the top of your roof, it would have stood out.
The coxcomb tile from Rakshas Trench would have been part of a stylised roof assembly on the high status side of the hall. So even though we still don't know what building she's actually got, we do know one thing: it was magnificent. It's always the last few finds that I find so intriguing, where everything begins to taper off.
Yeah, this one here is really interesting. This is the rim of a jar, and it dates to the late 9th or 10th century and was made in Lincoln.
God, you can hear how impressed the sky is by that date. Yeah.
this.
One last
one last
making
find.
piece.
We're a bit unsure about this, but I've had a look under the microscope and I think this is actually Anglo-Saxon and 5th to 8th century date. It is too small to be absolutely sure, but it's got a burnished surface and it looks as though it's got organics in it. So I think this is probably our earliest.
I'll tell you one person who'll be so pleased to see that, and that's Stuart.
Yeah, he will, won't he?
And the reason a tiny shard of pot will get Stuart's juices going is because it's the first evidence of Oakham's Saxon past within the castle walls. As ever though, Stuart's already one step ahead, scouring the surrounding town and adjacent park for evidence of Oakham in the time of its most famous Saxon resident, Queen Edith.
So how does this help us with our trenches?
Well, at the moment, we're fairly confined within the curtain wall of the Bailey, aren't we? That's where all our energy is concentrated. I think we need to be thinking of going outside into the park to the north, because the Bailey seems to be dropped within a bigger enclosure. So I think we'd need to explore more out there.
While Stuart starts building the case for investigating what he thinks is an outer enclosure or bailey, inside, Rakshaw's getting ever more glimpses of De Ferro's taste and interior design.
This is a bit of plaster. Can you see? It's got the impressions on the back for where you would have had like the timber wall, and really clear.
As well as the decorated plaster, there's a 13th century roof tile with a hole for the nail, and a chamfered cornerstone, an exquisitely crafted must-have on any posh building. Despite this good fortune, we're still scratching our heads for anything that sheds light on the function of this building. Well, it seems like the team have downed tools and escaped next door to ponder that very question. It's nothing to do with the beer, of course. No, this is a very serious end-of-day discussion. How have we done today?
It's been a mixed kind of day. I mean, but Rakshaw's trench has been absolutely fantastic. Those walls are brilliantly preserved.
How about you, Matt?
Well, there's no signs of any structures in my trench yet, no walls or floors, but I mean, it's still archaeological deposits at the bottom, so everything to play for.
You must have got to the bottom of your trench by now.
No, we keep going down. There's no sign of the bottom. And, I mean, obviously, if we go down, there will be a bottom, but I honestly don't know that getting to it is actually going to add anything to the story. I think that trench is pretty much finished.
So you can move on elsewhere tomorrow?
I reckon.
Stuart, where do you think he should dig tomorrow?
I think we should go and play in the park tomorrow.
Since when did you make these decisions? I thought he made the decisions.
I asked what he thought.
Yeah, well, no.
Easy, Tiger. Where do you think we should dig?
I think we should go into Cuts Close, which is in the park, and see if there's any evidence of the pre-Norman castle. Is there anything Anglo-Saxon?
Oh, that's such a long shot.
Yeah.
You may think it's a long shot, but you haven't done the survey.
Well, let him go and do the geophysics.
Would you be prepared to give Stuart a little bit of labour?
A small bit of labour, because it's coming out of Phil's trench.
Yep.
Reluctantly, yes, but I want to extend Rakshaw's trench because those curving walls really fascinate me.
All right, fair enough. You happy with that? Ish. All right. So tomorrow, hopefully, we're going to be able to pull together the whole story of the Norman castle. And will we discover anything Anglo-Saxon? Anglo-Saxon?
And will Stuart Ainsworth buy a round?
Beginning of day 3 here at Oakham in Rutland, and we're slap bang in the middle of a controversy. Somewhere in this park, Stuart reckons there's a kind of Anglo-Saxon compound, but Neil thinks that it's a waste of time looking for it, particularly as we haven't sorted out the Norman castle yet, and Phil won't even come out of the castle to dig the trench. Tim, you're the English Heritage Inspector. It's actually down to you. Are we justified?
I think so. It's a feature we don't understand well, and essentially we're talking about a small hole in a large feature, so the impact won't be very great.
What is this feature that we want to have a look at?
It's this bank here, and what we're trying to do is just take a section out of this bank to see if we can find what the bank buries.
Mr. Grouchy's had a chance to sleep on it. How do you feel now?
Pretty grouchy, actually. There's so many things we could do on this site, Tony, and we're a long way from the castle. Phil's in the right strop as it is. Really, all we want to do is just try and cut in. One there.
Yeah.
One bucket's width.
Technology lets us down
Technology
again.
crisis.
Neil's got a blocked nozzle.
This is the kind of drama we get all the time on Time Team. I'm really looking forward to who's going to tell Phil that he's got to dig this.
Phil's Norman kitchen trench is almost finished, but he's not exactly chomping at the bit to get cracking on Stuart's wildcard trench in the Outer Bailey, looking for Oakham's Saxon origins. But hints are being dropped.
What are you laughing at? Hey?
Meanwhile, in her stable trench, Tracy's still struggling with the archaeology. Over in the posh end, Rakshaw's trying to make sense of a jumble of walls in her trench, and next door in the chapel trench, Matt's similarly frustrated.
Every time I think I've got a wall in this trench, you investigate it and give it a scrape, and it turns out to be nothing.
It's not long before he and Cassie hit quite literally on the reason for the lack of any coherent structures.
Well, well, there you have it.
It's a devastating blow. It wouldn't be allowed now, but when this modern sewer pipe was put in during the 50s, all the Norman remains were churned up and destroyed, leaving Matt and Cassie at rock bottom with no chapel. But in the outer Castle Bailey, there's one man who doesn't need stuff in the ground to paint an evocative picture.
What we've got to do is look at the place in context, or the castle in context. For instance, just what we're walking out of now, if you went back to the 14th century, this would be a gigantic fish pond outside the castle.
Yeah.
The bank we've walked up in the 14th century is the edge of a big garden enclosure. These things are referred to in an inventory, so we've got a nice picture of what's going on with the Norman castle and what's around it in that period, but we've still got this outer enclosure issue to address, and I think there's compelling evidence that the castle is dropped within an earlier enclosure.
OK, this isn't just a crackpot theory. We've already found one piece of Saxon pot and know that when Queen Edith was here in the 11th century, Oakham was a significant Saxon settlement. Stuart's convinced that the defensive mound running around the Outer Bailey was there before the castle. It's what the Saxons would have called a burh.
So you think that this green bank is actually the Anglo-Saxon burh?
I do, and that green bank that's up there that's the perimeter along there.
And that's what we're putting the trench in, and that's why you're so keen to see if there's any evidence of Anglo-Saxon activity.
Yeah, it's the structure of the bank. What's it look like? How is it made? What material does it have in it? Does it have anything in at all? But it's something different to everything else that we can see in this landscape.
Right, time's short, Ian. Let's get on with it.
As Phil gets stuck in with his usual gusto, he makes two unusual finds right away. Half a plastic spoon and a ballpoint pen.
Wow, they never left any ink in it.
While Phil digs for Britain in an attempt to find something, anything Saxon, work has started on a traditional item long associated with the hall. Cassie's found herself a new job as a blacksmith's assistant.
Now, when you use a hammer, you don't use from your wrist, and you work from your elbow.
We've called in blacksmith John Spence, who was responsible for making the last 3 presentation horseshoes in the hall.
This is just rounding it off, yeah?
Yes, if you put it on the diagonal.
Horseshoes have been made by
Draw it down from
hand
here.
since the days when Walkland Ferrers might have ridden into the hall from a hunting expedition. But instead of bellows and a hammer, we've got the luxury of a blowtorch at 2,000 degrees centigrade that slices through metal like butter. 350 horseshoes dominate this extraordinary hall, and although we might not be quite the royal visiting party, we couldn't investigate Oakham without adding something of our own to the collection, something unique.
Is this ready?
Yes, it's all finished.
They're screaming
I'm
for
sure
it.
this will take pride of place among the others, but as our diggers revealed, there's much more to Oakham than ceremonial horseshoes. Time Team's finds expert Danny has had her work cut out investigating find after find that the site's thrown up.
You've come up with some lovely stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, we found some really nice things, actually. One of them is this medieval axe head. So you can see the blade here, and then this bit here is a socket. And that's where the handle would have gone, out here.
So it's quite small?
It is, actually. It's probably for woodworking.
What about this coin?
This well, it's not actually a coin. I know it looks very much like a coin.
Is it a jeton?
It is, yes. This is kind of years before they didn't have calculators and things like we do now. So it's almost a bit like, you know, how they had abacuses, and this is what they would use to actually sort of reckon up with. And it's got the head of Edward I on it.
And his dates are?
He's 1272 to 1307.
That's lovely for us, isn't it, with our medieval castle?
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
This has got to be my favourite find of the entire dig there, this little spoon.
I know, it's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is an apothecary's spoon, so it's used for dispensing drugs and for herbs and for medicinal purposes. So that's why it's so small, because you're actually sort of using very controlled measures.
Great.
But isn't it lovely?
Yeah. These beautiful finds are an insight into daily life at Oakham in the 12th century. Not just a stately residence, but a home to craftsmen, housekeepers and herbalists. It's not quite as easy to identify what was going on in Rakshaw's Trench, though. It's something posh, but probably not a bedchamber. And with hours to go, the walls just keep on coming.
Well, obviously we've got this main chunky one running through here.
Yeah.
And then you can see, as I'm stood here, there's another wall on a completely different alignment. They don't really match the main building either. So they're two buildings that we didn't even know were here at all. But Rob's been ferreting away and he's got himself the holy grail of pottery.
What is it, Rob?
Ta-da!
What is it?
Well, I'm reliably informed by our pottery expert that this is 10th, 11th century pot. And crucially, it's come from this deposit here, which is a sort of make-up of levelling layer that runs underneath the bottom course of this wall.
That might be exciting to archaeologists, but it's not really exciting to proper human beings, is it?
Well, it actually is. It tells me that this is much older than that building there.
Ah, so we've got cast iron dating evidence.
I think that's a result.
Identifying what sort of building this unusual wall belonged to has proved an impossible task. But underneath it, Rakshaw's got a wall that nobody was expecting to find. It's the first ever structural evidence of a Saxon building at Oakham, earlier than the Norman castle. And if we've got one Saxon building in the inner bailey, could Phil match that with something Saxon in the outer bailey? Hello, mate.
Hello, Tony.
How's your famous trench going on?
Well, my famous trench is nearly complete, actually. I'm just doing a bit of recording.
So what have you got?
Well, we do have the tail of the bank. You can actually see it in this section here. You see this grey material? And it literally is a wedge. This is the material that is washed down off the bank. Now, the really interesting bit, the crucial bit, is this bit here. You see this reddish clay layer, because that is the old ground surface, and that is the bit that is totally sealed by the bank, and it's the bit that would give us a date for the construction of the bank.
You say would give us a date?
It would give us a date for the construction of the bank if we found anything.
No fines?
No fines at all.
Stuart! Hello? No fines, absolutely no fines.
Well, that could be a bad thing.
Yeah?
But it could be a good thing.
In what way could it possibly be a good thing?
Well, if this bank had been constructed, say, in the 13th or 14th century, when there was lots of activity going on after the Norman period, there'd be a background pottery, background material being chucked up in the bank on that surface. The fact it's clean suggests it's been put on the surface where nothing else was happening. The implication for that would be that it's early.
This is this wonderful theory that Stuart's got. You want this to be a Saxon bank. The fact that I haven't actually found any evidence to knock that theory down for you is a good thing. It is an argument. I'd perfectly accept the argument. What I would say is that I believe that this bank was built on a virgin site. That's probably as far as I would go.
And could be earlier than the castle?
It could be earlier than the castle. It could even be earlier than the Saxons. You know, we simply don't know.
With all the other evidence you've got, it seems to me, as a punter, I think you've made a compelling case for this being an Anglo-Saxon burr. Thank you very much.
But you're gullible, aren't you? Yes, you are.
Good work, Phil.
Yeah.
Some of the finest archaeology you've done. Alright, it's tenuous, but this find, or lack of find, rounds off an exhausting 3 days where Time Team's rewritten Oakham's history. Oakham Castle was built within an earlier Saxon enclosure. The splendid Norman hall was encircled by walls and towers. Adjoining this were the kitchens and a service block, which in turn looked out over a substantial barn or stable. Behind the hall was probably a chapel and an incredibly lavish building stretching to the curtain wall. It may even have predated the castle altogether. Oakham, a place fit for royalty and home to one of the leading Norman knights of his age. It's been a really good 3 days, hasn't it? Lovely sight, but some very difficult archaeology.
Yeah, frustrating, perplexing, some dodgy geophysics that gave us false clues. But, you know, when we actually found the archaeology, it was fantastic quality. It's just we didn't find it everywhere we looked.
Phil, it's been a real emotional helter-skelter of a 3 days for you, hasn't it?
It has been an absolutely emotional helter-skelter, Tony. And I mean, what I've learned more than anything else is what a vivid imagination Stuart Ainsworth has. How he can come up with what seems like a very plausible story from absolutely no evidence.
Despite being on the receiving end of Phil's fury, actually you did manage to provide us with a whole different strand, a whole new story around Oakham, the Anglo-Saxon story. You must be pleased.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I've learned an awful lot this week. I've managed to avoid buying Phil a drink for a start off, which is good to you. But to be able to look at the castle in the town, its place in the town, how the town's evolved, that's a great thrill to be able to do that. So yeah, I've enjoyed it enormously.
It has been a funny old dig. So often we find walls and we find floors, but hardly any finds. This time we've been inundated with shed loads of finds and hardly any structures at all. But I guess it doesn't matter. What's important is that we tell a good story.
Hello, my name's John Gator. Time Team is fan-funded by Patreon. This vital support helps us to make new episodes. Joining Patreon gives you access to exclusive interviews, 3D models and masterclasses, plus lots more.